Good day, grade 7. This is the first history lesson that I will present to you. As you know by now, the history we're doing this term is the transatlantic slave trade. Trans, the prefix trans means across. So when we talk about transatlantic, we refer to across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so slavery basically meaning people that were taken without the permission, captured, either kidnapped from wars or slave raids and so on. We'll get to that later. But people captured and taken and basically being held prisoners and forced to do work without being paid and without having the option to leave if they want to leave. In a nutshell, that is what slavery is. Now, in this time in history, slavery wasn't yet illegal in the world, and there were still, in most parts of the world, people had slaves and they used slave labor because obviously it was much cheaper to have a slave and to underfeed them than to just simply pay them. So the specific type of slavery we're referring to in this term is the transatlantic slave trade. Now, even though slaves were taken all over the world by all types of people, we're specifically focusing on African slaves that were taken to the American South, right, during the 17th and 16th century. So first of all, I'm here. You can open up your books on page 102, and we'll quickly look here on these two pages, the reason for the slave trade, right? Why did the need for slavery arise? So during this part of history, it was when what we now know as the United States were being settled by European countries and people from Europe, right? People from Spain and Portugal initially, but also people from England and all other countries in Europe. And because they then basically exterminated the indigenous people of the Americas, which was the Indians or the Native Americans, they had now countless and abundance of land, right? They have land as far as the eye could see, very fertile land, meaning it was very productive land, and they saw the opportunity where they could make massive plantations of any type of produce they liked, and the opportunity was there for them to make lots of money. So all of these immigrants now coming from Europe to America, they staked their claims and towns formed, and as the country started to form, it was built basically on these huge plantations, and the labor they used for these plantations was slaves. Initially, they tried to take the Native American people as slaves to use them as labor, but that didn't work well. The people didn't take to it, and it just didn't work. So then eventually they settled into the pattern of getting slaves off the west coast of Africa mainly, but other parts in Africa as well. And something we call the triangular slave trade started. But we'll get to that in a moment. If you have a look here on the map on page 102, right, you'll see here, this is in the 19th century already, the different states in America. Now the bottom ones, which we call the red states, those were the ones in which slavery was still legal and where all of these slave plantations were. And then more to the north, you'll see the blue states, right? Those are the ones that started abolishing slavery. Also, eventually, this led to a civil war between these two regions. But for our purpose now, it's just important to know that this is mainly the states where the slaves went to, right? Also to the Caribbean islands as well, but we'll get to that later. You'll see here we have 4 examples of the main types of plantations that the slaves worked on page 102. We have tobacco plantations. Tobacco, as hopefully you don't know yet, is a plant that is used to make all the types of things that goes into cigarettes and pipe and stuff like that. Tobacco, right? So the tobacco plants, you can see there, it almost looks like cabbage, but then it's dried out and the leaves are made fine, and they put that in cigarettes and in pipe tobacco and so on. We've got rice plantations, sugarcane plantations, and then cotton plantations. Now, these 4 were the main 4 plantations on which the slaves worked in the American South, and it's also important for you to know these 4 types of plantations, right? Now, let's turn to the next page, page 104. This is an extremely important part. If it isn't marked in your book already, you can just mark it there with a pencil. Number 3, How did the slaves get to the American South? This is the route that was used, right? And this is the one we call the transatlantic triangular slave trade. Now, the reason we say it's triangular, it is because if you see there that little diagram there, the small map, you can see that it almost looks like a triangle, okay? Meaning the people, the slavers, were European people mostly. So they started in Europe, then they traveled southwards with their ships laden full of manufactured goods to go and trade these goods to with the people in Africa. They usually took stuff that the people in Africa didn't have at the time. It's like ammunition, weapons, ornamental stuff like beads and silks and jewelry. They took these things to Africa and they traded it there for slaves, right? So the same ships that were full of the manufactured goods were now emptied out and they were stuffed full of slaves. Then they took the second route across the Atlantic Ocean, which is now the base of the so-called triangle, to North America, where they then loaded off the slaves. And then once again, in the empty ships now, they took all the raw materials that the people grew on the slave plantations. So all the different things that the slaves grew, they took it from them there, and then they took it all the way back to Europe, where these raw materials were then given into the factories, which were eventually made into all the different goods that the people sold and ate there in Europe. So this triangle here, as you can see, this made the whole system work, because even though the slaves were in North America and all the plantations were in North America, one of the main sources still were the people left in Europe. So more than 80% of the produce that was made in the slave plantations didn't stay in North America. It went back to Europe, right, to feed the ever-growing population. So that is why this system could have worked and why it did work so well. And because of this system, there were people who became extremely rich. And it's also, ironically enough, the basis of the American wealth, the country where it got most of its wealth from, is from this slave plantations. This little diagram here at the bottom is extremely important. You must be able to know for which areas in the world were part of the triangular slave trade. Now you'll see here it is split up into 3 stages. Stage 1, Stage 2, and Stage 3. Now Stage 1, simply, that is the first leg of the passage, right? That's when the ships came from their home ports in Europe, like I said. And what did they have on their ships? Manufactured goods. I'll give you a couple examples, like ammunition, jewelry, and so on. Then they went to Africa, right? Because that's where all the slaves came from. For this specific type of slave we're referring to now, it came from Africa. So they went there, and then the second leg started between Africa and North America. After they've emptied their ships, they now made their ships full of slaves, right? So now they took the slaves from Africa to North America, where they had to go work on the plantations. That's the second leg. And then the third leg, which was the homeward bound, right? They're going back home, and their ships were full of raw materials. So this is another example of a great essay question as well. If I were to ask you, please discuss in detail the triangular transatlantic slave trade, then you have to explain all of this to me. Give all the different stages, what were on the ships, the cargo, also where did they go, from what port to what port, with an introduction and an ending. And it's a lovely 15-point essay question. Okay, this is extremely important. So it's also important that you copy this whole orange block like this into your exercise books, but not in this format. Try and do it in the format of an essay question from the start, right? Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3 can be your 3 different paragraphs. You start off with the introduction and you end off with an ending. And then also you need to add a drawing of the small map over here. All right, that's the end of the first lesson. Thank you very much.